In the Bible, he's called Nimrod, the mighty hunter, the founder of Babylon, the first empire builder on earth. In Mesopotamian clay tablets, he's called Gilgamesh, the two-thirds divine king who sought immortality, whose epic poem is the oldest in the world. For 150 years, scholars have asked the same explosive question: are they the same person? Did the Bible and the Babylonian tablets preserve memories of the same ancient king, seen through different eyes? The answer could rewrite everything we know about the dawn of civilization. This is the untold story of Nimrod and Gilgamesh. In the ancient world, two names echo across millennia with extraordinary power. One comes from the pages of the Hebrew Bible, appearing in just a few cryptic verses that have puzzled scholars for thousands of years. The other emerges from the buried cities of Mesopotamia, carved into clay tablets that lay hidden beneath desert sands until the 19th century brought them back into human consciousness. These two figures, separated by different cultures and different texts, share something remarkable. They are both remembered as the first great empire builders of human civilization, mighty hunters who defied the gods, and kings whose very names became synonymous with rebellion and power. The biblical figure is Nimrod, described in Genesis as a mighty hunter before the Lord, the founder of Babylon, and the first king to establish an empire across multiple cities. The Mesopotamian figure is Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, whose epic poem stands as one of humanity's oldest surviving works of literature, a hero who was two-thirds divine and one-third mortal, who sought immortality and whose deeds were celebrated across the ancient Near East. For nearly 2 centuries, a compelling question has haunted biblical scholars, archaeologists, and historians. Are these two figures actually the same person, remembered differently by different cultures? Is Nimrod simply the Hebrew version of Gilgamesh, the same historical ruler filtered through the lens of biblical tradition? This question is not merely an academic curiosity. If Nimrod and Gilgamesh are indeed the same individual, it would fundamentally reshape our understanding of ancient history, biblical chronology, and the relationship between Hebrew tradition and Mesopotamian civilization. It would mean that one of the Bible's most enigmatic figures has been hiding in plain sight all along, his true identity preserved not in scripture, but in the epic literature of Babylon. It would connect two of the ancient world's most important literary traditions through a single towering personality who stood at the dawn of urban civilization. The story begins in 1872, when George Smith, a young assistant at the British Museum, made one of the most dramatic discoveries in the history of archaeology. While sorting through fragments of cuneiform tablets recovered from the ruins of Nineveh, Smith deciphered a passage that stopped him in his tracks. The tablet described a great flood that destroyed humanity, with only one righteous man and his family surviving in a massive boat. The parallels to the biblical story of Noah were unmistakable, but this account came from an entirely different tradition, written hundreds of years before the oldest biblical manuscripts. Smith was so overwhelmed by the discovery that he reportedly began stripping off his clothes in excitement, running around the room in a state of scholarly euphoria. This tablet was part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and its discovery revolutionized our understanding of the ancient world. Suddenly, biblical scholars had to confront the reality that stories they had considered unique to Hebrew tradition were actually part of a broader Mesopotamian literary heritage. The Genesis flood narrative was not an isolated revelation, but rather part of a cultural conversation that spanned the entire ancient Near East. If the Bible's flood story had such clear connections to Mesopotamian literature, what about other biblical figures and narratives? Could other enigmatic characters from Genesis also be rooted in the historical and legendary figures of Babylon and Sumer? This question became particularly acute when scholars turned their attention to Nimrod. The biblical description of this figure is frustratingly brief, appearing primarily in Genesis chapter 10 in the so-called Table of Nations that lists the descendants of Noah after the flood. The passage reads, "Cush begot Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord." The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria and built Nineveh. Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Resen, between Nineveh and Calah, that is, the great city. This passage is remarkable for several reasons. First, it interrupts the genealogical list to provide narrative detail about Nimrod, suggesting that the biblical author considered him particularly significant. Second, it explicitly states that Nimrod was the first on earth to be a mighty man, using the Hebrew word gibor, which suggests not just physical strength, but also the qualities of a warrior, a hero, and a ruler. Third, it associates Nimrod with the foundation of some of the most important cities in Mesopotamian history: Babel, which is Babylon; Erech, which is Uruk; Akkad, which is Akkad; and Nineveh, the great capital of Assyria. This is an extraordinary resume, attributing to a single individual the founding of the major urban centers that would dominate Near Eastern history for millennia. The phrase "mighty hunter before the Lord" has generated endless scholarly debate. The Hebrew preposition before can mean either in the sight of or in opposition to, leading to two very different interpretations. Some scholars read this as praise, suggesting that Nimrod was a great hunter who operated with divine approval, protecting early humanity from dangerous animals and establishing civilization. Others read it as condemnation, suggesting that Nimrod was a hunter in defiance of God, perhaps hunting not animals, but men, establishing his empire through conquest and oppression. This ambiguity has made Nimrod a complex and contested figure in biblical interpretation. Jewish tradition, preserved in texts like the Book of Jasher and various midrashic sources, overwhelmingly interprets Nimrod as a villain. These traditions identify him as the architect of the Tower of Babel, the great ziggurat that represented humanity's attempt to storm heaven and make a name for themselves without God. According to these traditions, Nimrod was not just a king, but a religious revolutionary who sought to unite humanity in rebellion against the divine order established after the flood. Some Jewish texts even claim that Nimrod tried to kill Abraham, throwing him into a fiery furnace when the patriarch refused to worship idols. Though Abraham miraculously survived, the confrontation established Nimrod as the archetypal tyrant, the first in a long line of kings who would persecute God's people. When scholars began deciphering cuneiform texts in the 19th century and reconstructed the Epic of Gilgamesh, the parallels to Nimrod seemed too striking to ignore. Like Nimrod, Gilgamesh was explicitly described as the founder of Uruk's great walls and buildings. Like Nimrod, Gilgamesh was remembered as a mighty warrior and hunter who performed extraordinary feats of strength. Like Nimrod, Gilgamesh was associated with the earliest period of Mesopotamian civilization, positioned at the transition point between the prehistoric and the historical. Most intriguingly, the city of Erech mentioned in the Genesis account of Nimrod is precisely the city of Uruk, Gilgamesh's capital. Could this be coincidence? Or was the Bible preserving a distorted memory of the great Mesopotamian hero king? The theory gained additional support from linguistic analysis. Some scholars noted that the name Nimrod might be related to the Akkadian word namru, meaning bright or illustrious, which could be an epithet rather than a proper name. If Nimrod is indeed an epithet meaning the illustrious one or the rebellious one, then it might not be a personal name at all, but rather a title or description applied to a figure whose real name was preserved in other traditions. Gilgamesh, according to this theory, would be the actual name, while Nimrod would be the biblical writer's way of characterizing him as a rebel against divine authority. Other scholars pointed to the chronological framework of Genesis. According to the biblical genealogy, Nimrod was the great-grandson of Noah, placing him in the immediate post-flood period. The Sumerian king list, a crucial document for understanding early Mesopotamian chronology, places Gilgamesh as the fifth king of Uruk in the first dynasty after the flood. Both traditions, therefore, position their respective heroes in roughly the same chronological window. The formative period immediately following the Great Deluge, when civilization was being rebuilt and the first great cities were being established. The geographic overlap is equally compelling. Genesis explicitly states that Nimrod's kingdom included Babylon, Uruk, and Akkad in the land of Shinar, which is Sumer, as well as cities in Assyria, including Nineveh. This describes essentially the entire Mesopotamian cultural sphere, from southern Sumer to northern Assyria. While we have no evidence that Gilgamesh personally ruled all these cities, he was celebrated throughout Mesopotamian civilization as an archetypal king, and his legend was known from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. If the biblical author was trying to describe the cultural influence and legendary status of Gilgamesh rather than his precise political control, the Genesis description would make perfect sense. The proposal that Nimrod is Gilgamesh first gained serious scholarly attention in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Archaeologists and biblical scholars began comparing the two figures systematically, noting not just the broad similarities, but also specific parallels in their stories and characteristics. Both were described as builders of great walls and cities. Both were famous hunters who ventured into wild lands. Both had complex relationships with divinity, being neither fully mortal nor fully divine. Both became legendary figures whose names were invoked across generations. Both were associated with the dawn of civilization and the establishment of the first great cities. However, the theory also faced significant challenges from the beginning. The name Nimrod does not obviously correspond to Gilgamesh linguistically. The biblical chronology, if taken literally, places Nimrod several centuries earlier than the most probable dates for any historical Gilgamesh. The biblical text emphasizes Nimrod's role as a hunter, while the Epic of Gilgamesh focuses more on his quest for immortality and his friendship with Enkidu. Most significantly, Gilgamesh is remembered in Mesopotamian tradition as a wise and eventually good king who brought prosperity to Uruk, while Jewish tradition remembers Nimrod as an evil tyrant who oppressed humanity. These are not small differences, but rather seem to represent fundamentally different assessments of the same supposed individual. As the 20th century progressed and more Mesopotamian texts were discovered and deciphered, the debate became increasingly sophisticated. Archaeologists working at Uruk uncovered evidence suggesting that Gilgamesh might have been a real historical figure, probably ruling sometime around 2700 BCE. They found building inscriptions and administrative texts that mentioned a king whose name could be read as Gilgamesh, suggesting that he was not merely a literary invention, but an actual ruler whose deeds became the foundation for later legends. This discovery lent credibility to those who argued that Nimrod too might have a historical basis, representing Hebrew memories of the same Mesopotamian king. At the same time, scholars gained a deeper understanding of how ancient traditions preserved and transmitted historical memories. They recognized that ancient texts often conflated multiple historical figures into composite characters, that names could shift dramatically across languages and cultures, and that moral assessments of historical figures often changed depending on the political and religious perspectives of those doing the remembering. Just as Alexander the Great is remembered as a heroic liberator in Greek tradition and as a destructive conqueror in Persian tradition, perhaps Gilgamesh could be remembered as a wise culture hero in Mesopotamian tradition and as a tyrannical rebel in Hebrew tradition. The question, is Nimrod Gilgamesh, therefore opens up into a much broader investigation of how ancient civilizations remembered their past, how historical figures became legendary heroes, and how different cultures interpreted the same events and personalities through radically different cultural lenses. To answer this question properly, we need to examine not just the surface similarities between these two figures, but the entire context in which they appear. The archaeological evidence for early Mesopotamian civilization, the development of biblical tradition, the transmission of legends across cultures, and the methods by which modern scholarship attempts to reconstruct ancient history from fragmentary evidence. This documentary will undertake that examination systematically. We will explore what the Bible actually tells us about Nimrod, what the Epic of Gilgamesh and other cuneiform sources tell us about Gilgamesh, what archaeology reveals about the early kings of Uruk, and how scholars have attempted to connect or distinguish these figures over the past century and a half. We will consider the arguments made by those who believe the two figures are identical, the objections raised by skeptics, and the alternative theories that have been proposed. Most importantly, we will situate this question within the broader story of how ancient civilizations rose, how they remembered their founders, and how those memories have shaped human culture down to the present day. The stakes are high. If Nimrod and Gilgamesh are the same person, it means that one of the world's oldest surviving epic poems is actually about a biblical figure, that the Bible preserves authentic memories of Mesopotamian history, and that the cultural exchange between Hebrew and Mesopotamian traditions was deeper and more ancient than many scholars have recognized. If they are different people, it raises equally fascinating questions about why two different cultures would create such similar legendary figures at similar points in their histories, about how archetypes of kingship and heroism emerged in the ancient Near East, and about the nature of cultural memory itself. We begin our investigation with a closer look at what we actually know, what we think we know, and what remains tantalizingly uncertain about these two towering figures from humanity's ancient past. The biblical Nimrod. To understand whether Nimrod could be Gilgamesh, we must first understand what the Hebrew Bible actually tells us about this enigmatic figure. The textual evidence for Nimrod is remarkably sparse, contained almost entirely within a few verses of Genesis chapter 10, and briefly referenced in Genesis 11 and 1 Chronicles 1. Yet from these few verses, an elaborate tradition emerged that would influence Jewish, Christian, and Islamic interpretation for thousands of years. The primary passage appears in Genesis 10:8-12, which reads in the New Revised Standard Version, "Cush became the father of Nimrod. He was the first on earth to become a mighty warrior. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Uruk, Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. From that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Resen, between Nineveh and Calah, that is the great city." This passage appears within the Table of Nations, a genealogical structure that maps out how Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, populated the earth after the flood. The Table of Nations is not merely a family tree, but rather an ethnographic document that explains the biblical author's understanding of how different peoples and nations came to occupy their respective territories. It groups peoples by language, land, and lineage, creating a comprehensive map of the ancient Near Eastern world as understood in ancient Israel. Nimrod appears in the line of Ham through Cush. This placement is significant. In biblical tradition, Ham was the son who saw his father Noah naked and drunk, leading to Noah's curse upon Canaan, Ham's son. The descendants of Ham are generally associated with peoples who were in conflict with Israel, the Canaanites, the Egyptians, and various African peoples. By placing Nimrod in Ham's line through Cush, the biblical author is already signaling something about how this figure should be understood. Cush is typically identified with the region south of Egypt, roughly corresponding to modern Sudan and Ethiopia, though some scholars argue for a Mesopotamian Cush as well. The statement that Nimrod was the first on earth to become a mighty warrior uses the Hebrew phrase, Hu hechel lihiot gibor ba'aretz. The word gibor is particularly loaded with meaning in biblical Hebrew. It appears throughout the Hebrew Bible to describe warriors, heroes, and mighty men. In Genesis 6, the Gibborim are the offspring of the sons of God and human women, mysterious figures of great power who lived before the flood. By calling Nimrod a Gibbor, the text connects him to this tradition of extraordinary individuals who transcended normal human limitations. The phrase, "he was the first," is also significant. In Hebrew, hechel means he began, or he was the first. This suggests that Nimrod initiated something new, that he represented a break with what came before. Some scholars interpret this as indicating that Nimrod was the first empire builder, the first king to rule over multiple cities rather than just a single urban center. Others see it as suggesting that Nimrod was the first tyrant, the first ruler to dominate others through military force rather than consensual leadership. The ambiguity is built into the text itself. The description of Nimrod as a mighty hunter before the Lord has generated perhaps more interpretive controversy than any other aspect of the passage. The Hebrew phrase is Gibor Chayid Lifnei Hwh. The word chayid clearly means hunter, but the preposition lifnei can mean either in the presence of or in opposition to. This double meaning is not accidental. Hebrew often uses the same preposition for opposite concepts, requiring context to determine which meaning is intended. The phrase before the Lord could therefore mean either that Nimrod hunted with God's approval and blessing, perhaps protecting humanity from dangerous animals in the primitive post-flood world, or that Nimrod hunted in defiance of God, perhaps even hunting human beings rather than animals, establishing his power through violence and conquest. The text then provides what appears to be a proverbial saying, therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. This quotation of what seems to be a popular proverb suggests that in the time when Genesis was written, Nimrod's name had become proverbial, a byword for hunting prowess, or, depending on interpretation, for tyrannical power. The fact that his name had achieved proverbial status indicates that the original audience would have known much more about Nimrod than the biblical text explicitly tells us. The author is referencing a larger cultural knowledge that has since been lost. The geographic information provided in verses 9 through 12 is extraordinarily specific and historically valuable. The text states that the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Uruk, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. This list is remarkable because it includes some of the most important cities in Mesopotamian history. Babel is unquestionably Babylon, which would become the greatest city of the ancient Near East and the capital of multiple empires. Uruk is Uruk, one of the oldest cities in human history, and, according to archaeology, perhaps the world's first true urban center. Akkad is Akkad, which gave its name to both a language and an empire. Calneh is more difficult to identify with certainty, but it likely refers to another important Mesopotamian city. The phrase land of Shinar is the biblical term for Sumer, or more broadly, Mesopotamia. It appears elsewhere in Genesis in the Tower of Babel story, where humanity gathers in the land of Shinar to build a city and tower reaching to heaven. This connection is not coincidental. The text is explicitly linking Nimrod to Babylon and implicitly to the Tower of Babel, though the relationship is left somewhat ambiguous. The passage then states that, from that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Resen between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. This expansion into Assyria, the region of northern Mesopotamia, extends Nimrod's domain from the southern alluvial plain of Sumer all the way to the northern highlands. Nineveh would later become the magnificent capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, one of the most powerful military states in ancient history. Calah, also called Nimrod by modern archaeologists in what appears to be an echo of the biblical tradition, was another major Assyrian city. The phrase, "that is the great city," could refer either to Resen or to the entire complex of cities mentioned, suggesting an urban agglomeration that prefigured the later great metropolises of Assyrian power. This geographic description attributes to Nimrod the founding of essentially all the major urban centers of ancient Mesopotamian civilization, from the Sumerian south to the Assyrian north. This is historically implausible if taken literally. These cities were not all founded at the same time by the same person. However, if we understand the passage as attributing to Nimrod the cultural or symbolic foundation of Mesopotamian civilization as a whole, it makes more sense. Nimrod is being presented as the archetypal Mesopotamian king, the figure who inaugurated the urban imperial tradition that would characterize Mesopotamian political culture for 3 millennia. The only other significant biblical reference to Nimrod appears in Micah 5:6, where the prophet speaks of the land of Nimrod as a poetic parallel to Assyria. This confirms that biblical tradition associated Nimrod primarily with Mesopotamia in general and Assyria in particular. The fact that a prophetic text written many centuries after Genesis still uses Nimrod's name as a designation for Mesopotamian territory indicates that this association remained stable throughout Israelite tradition. Beyond the biblical text itself, Jewish interpretive tradition significantly expanded the Nimrod story. The Book of Jasher, a medieval Jewish text that claims to preserve ancient traditions, provides an elaborate narrative of Nimrod's life. According to Jasher, Nimrod found garments that God had made for Adam and Eve, and wearing these garments gave him supernatural power over animals, which is how he became a mighty hunter. This power brought him fame, and he gathered an army and made himself king over all humanity, establishing his capital at Babel. The Book of Jasher then connects Nimrod directly to the Tower of Babel incident. According to this tradition, Nimrod was the driving force behind the tower's construction, seeking to make a name for himself and unite humanity under his rule in defiance of God's command to spread out and fill the earth. The tower was not merely a building project, but a religious and political statement, an attempt to establish human autonomy from divine authority. When God confused human languages and scattered the people, Nimrod's empire collapsed, but he retained control over Babylon and continued to rule as a tyrant. Perhaps most dramatically, the Book of Jasher and related midrashic sources describe a confrontation between Nimrod and Abraham. According to these traditions, Nimrod was an idolater who worshipped fire and commanded all his subjects to do the same. Abraham, while still a young man living in Nimrod's kingdom, began preaching monotheism and smashing idols. Nimrod ordered Abraham to be executed by burning, but God miraculously protected Abraham, causing the fire to consume Nimrod's servants instead while Abraham remained unharmed. Abraham then left Nimrod's kingdom, beginning his journey to Canaan. This story, though not found in the Bible itself, became enormously influential in Jewish tradition. It established Nimrod as the archetypal tyrant and idolater, the original enemy of the Jewish people and of monotheism itself. Islamic tradition, drawing on these Jewish sources, incorporated similar stories, with Nimrod appearing in the Quran and Islamic commentaries as an example of the arrogant ruler who defies God's prophets. The Christian tradition also developed its own Nimrod interpretations. Many church fathers saw Nimrod as prefiguring various later tyrants who persecuted the faithful. Some early Christian sources connected Nimrod to Babylonian astrology and the worship of false gods, seeing him as the originator of pagan religion. Medieval Christian tradition sometimes portrayed Nimrod as a giant, connecting him to the giants mentioned elsewhere in Genesis. Renaissance and Reformation interpreters used Nimrod as a symbol of political tyranny and religious apostasy, with some identifying contemporary rulers and religious leaders as modern-day Nimrods. From a linguistic perspective, the name Nimrod itself has been the subject of extensive analysis. The Hebrew form is Nimrod, spelled Nun Mem Resh Vav Dalet. Several etymologies have been proposed. The most common derives it from the Hebrew root marad, meaning to rebel. According to this interpretation, Nimrod means we shall rebel or let us rebel, perfectly capturing his character as a rebel against God. This etymology would explain why Jewish tradition so consistently portrays him as rebellious and tyrannical. However, others have proposed non-Semitic origins for the name. Some scholars suggest it derives from the Akkadian god Ninurta, a warrior deity associated with hunting and conquest, whose name could have been modified into Nimrod through folk etymology. Others propose connections to various Mesopotamian royal names or epithets. If Nimrod is indeed Gilgamesh, then the name Nimrod might represent a Hebrew interpretation or translation of Gilgamesh's attributes rather than a preservation of his actual name. The chronological placement of Nimrod in biblical genealogy is also significant. According to Genesis 10, Nimrod was the son of Cush, who was the son of Ham, who was the son of Noah. This places Nimrod in the third generation after the flood, making him Noah's great-grandson. If we accept the biblical chronology literally and place the flood around 2350 BCE based on the ages given in Genesis, Nimrod would have lived sometime around 2250–2200 BCE. However, most scholars do not take these dates literally, recognizing that the biblical genealogies often skip generations and compress historical time. The Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, provides some interesting striking variations in its rendering of the Nimrod passage. In some places, it uses different vocabulary that subtly shifts the meaning. For instance, where the Hebrew describes Nimrod as a gibber, the Septuagint uses the Greek word gigas, meaning giant, which influenced later traditions that portrayed Nimrod as physically enormous. The Septuagint also makes some adjustments to the geographic list, reflecting different understandings of the city names. From a source-critical perspective, most scholars assign the Nimrod passage to the Jawist or J-source, one of the hypothetical documents that, according to the documentary hypothesis, were combined to create the Pentateuch. The J-source is generally dated to around the 10th or 9th century BCE, though this dating is contested. If this dating is correct, it means that Israelite tradition was preserving memories or legends about Nimrod from at least 1,000 years after any plausible historical date for a real figure behind the legend. This substantial time gap raises important questions about how accurate these memories could be and how much they had been transformed by oral transmission and theological interpretation. The question naturally arises, if the biblical text is so sparse and ambiguous, why has Nimrod exercised such a powerful hold on the religious imagination? Part of the answer lies precisely in the text's ambiguity. By providing just enough information to establish Nimrod as a powerful and significant figure without fully explaining who he was or what he did, the biblical text created a vacuum that later interpretation rushed to fill. Every generation could project onto Nimrod its own anxieties about power, empire, and the relationship between human authority and divine sovereignty. But there may be another reason for Nimrod's enduring significance. If the biblical author was indeed preserving a memory, however distorted, of a real historical figure who loomed large in Mesopotamian tradition, then the text's brevity might not indicate ignorance, but rather the opposite, the assumption that readers already knew who Nimrod was. The text provides just enough information to identify Nimrod with a figure that audiences would have recognized from other sources, perhaps including Mesopotamian literature and legend that circulated throughout the ancient Near East. This brings us back to the central question. When the Genesis author wrote about Nimrod, the mighty hunter, the first empire builder, the founder of Babel and Uruk, was he describing a purely legendary figure invented by Hebrew tradition? Was he preserving distorted memories of some otherwise unknown Mesopotamian king? Or was he referring, under a different name or with a different interpretation, to a figure whose story was being told simultaneously in cuneiform tablets, the great king Gilgamesh of Uruk? To answer this question, we must now turn to those cuneiform tablets themselves and examine what Mesopotamian sources tell us about Gilgamesh, how his legend developed, and what archaeology reveals about the historical reality behind the myth. The Mesopotamian Gilgamesh. When George Smith pieced together the fragments of the Epic of Gilgamesh in 1872, he opened a window onto a literary tradition far older and more sophisticated than anyone in the Victorian era had imagined possible. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not a single text, but rather a tradition that evolved over more than a millennium, beginning with Sumerian poems about the kings of Uruk in the 3rd millennium BCE, and culminating in the standard Akkadian version, compiled by a scholar priest named Sinleki sometime in the late 2nd millennium BCE. To understand Gilgamesh and his potential connection to Nimrod, we must examine this tradition in all its complexity, from its earliest roots to its final literary form. The earliest references to Gilgamesh appear in Sumerian texts from the early dynastic period, roughly 2900–2350 BCE. These are not unified narratives, but rather separate poems, each recounting a different adventure or episode from Gilgamesh's life. The Sumerian poems include Gilgamesh and the Bull of Heaven, Gilgamesh and Huwawa, Gilgamesh and the Netherworld, the Death of Gilgamesh, and several others. These poems were probably performed orally before being written down, and they treat Gilgamesh as a figure from the relatively recent past, a great king whose deeds were still remembered and celebrated. In these early Sumerian poems, Gilgamesh is consistently identified as the king of Uruk, the most important city in southern Mesopotamia during the early dynastic period. He is described as a warrior of extraordinary strength and courage who performs supernatural feats. He journeys to distant lands, defeats monsters, and challenges the gods themselves. He builds great walls and magnificent buildings, making Uruk the greatest city in the world. He is also depicted as a sometimes arrogant and oppressive king whose power needs to be checked by divine intervention. One of the earliest and most important Sumerian poems, Gilgamesh and Huwawa, tells how Gilgamesh journeyed with his servant Enkidu to the cedar forest to cut down sacred trees and kill the monster Huwawa, who guarded them. This expedition demonstrates Gilgamesh's courage but also his hubris, as he is invading a sacred realm protected by the gods. The poem emphasizes Gilgamesh's role as a builder who needs timber for his construction projects, connecting his military adventures to his civilizing mission of building great cities. Another crucial early poem is Gilgamesh and the Bull of Heaven, in which the goddess Inanna becomes angry with Gilgamesh and sends the Bull of Heaven to destroy Uruk. Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill the bull, saving the city, but also committing an act of sacrilege that offends the gods. This episode highlights the tension in Gilgamesh's character between his role as protector of civilization and his tendency toward defiance of divine authority, a tension that would become central to the later, more sophisticated versions of his story. The death of Gilgamesh is particularly significant because it confronts the hero's mortality. Despite his great deeds and his partial divine ancestry, Gilgamesh must die like all humans. The poem describes his death and funeral, his journey to the underworld, and how his memory is preserved by his descendants and the citizens of Uruk. The poem establishes a theme that would dominate the later epic: the hero's quest for immortality and his ultimate failure to escape death, teaching him that the only true immortality comes through leaving a lasting legacy. These Sumerian poems were clearly based on a larger body of oral tradition about Gilgamesh. They reference events and characters that are mentioned but not fully explained, suggesting that audiences already knew the basic outlines of Gilgamesh's story. The poems were not telling a new story, but rather performing familiar material, each poem focusing on one particular episode in the hero's life. This oral tradition must have been extremely well known and widely performed throughout Sumer, because Gilgamesh references appear in economic documents, in royal inscriptions, and even in proverbs and everyday sayings from this period. The Old Babylonian period, roughly 2000 to 1600 BCE, saw the tradition transform as Akkadian-speaking scribes began adapting and combining the Sumerian poems into longer, more unified narratives. Several versions of the Gilgamesh story exist from this period, found at different sites throughout Mesopotamia. These Old Babylonian versions are not simply translations of the Sumerian, but rather creative retellings that reorganize the material, add new episodes, and introduce deeper philosophical reflection on the meaning of Gilgamesh's adventures. The most complete Old Babylonian version comes from tablets found at the site of ancient Sippar. This version introduces several elements that would become central to the final epic. It gives greater prominence to Enkidu, transforming him from a mere servant into Gilgamesh's beloved friend and equal, whose death becomes the catalyst for Gilgamesh's quest for immortality. It adds the meeting with Siduri the alewife, who offers Gilgamesh wisdom about accepting mortality and enjoying life's simple pleasures. Most significantly, it incorporates the flood story, having Gilgamesh travel to visit Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian Noah who survived the Great Deluge and was granted immortality by the gods. The standard Babylonian version, compiled probably around 1300–1000 BCE by the scholar Sinleki Unini, represents the culmination of this literary evolution. This is the version that George Smith discovered and that most people today think of as the Epic of Gilgamesh. It consists of 11 tablets plus a 12th that appears to be a direct translation of the Sumerian poem Gilgamesh and the Netherworld. The standard version organizes the earlier episodic material into a coherent narrative arc with a clear beginning, middle, and end, and it adds sophisticated literary devices, symbolic imagery, and philosophical depth that make it one of the masterpieces of ancient literature. The standard version begins with a prologue that introduces Gilgamesh as the greatest of kings, who saw everything, knew everything, and brought back secret knowledge from before the flood. It describes how he built the walls of Uruk, walls so magnificent that they would endure forever. But it also notes that Gilgamesh was an oppressive king who abused his power, exhausting the young men of Uruk with forced labor and claiming the right to sleep with brides before their husbands. The gods, hearing the complaints of Uruk's citizens, create Enkidu as a wild man who lives with the animals, setting up the confrontation that will transform both characters. The story of how Enkidu is civilized is one of the epic's most fascinating sequences. A hunter discovers Enkidu and, frightened by his strength, reports him to Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh sends a temple prostitute named Shamhat to seduce Enkidu, and through sexual encounter, Enkidu becomes human, losing his connection to the animals but gaining consciousness, language, and culture. Shamhat then teaches Enkidu to eat bread, drink beer, wear clothes, and behave like a civilized human. This transformation from wild man to civilized man encapsulates the Mesopotamian understanding of what separates humanity from animals, not intelligence or tool use, but participation in urban culture with all its pleasures and constraints. Enkidu travels to Uruk to confront Gilgamesh, and they fight in a tremendous battle that ends in mutual respect. They become inseparable friends, and together they undertake the journey to the cedar forest to kill Humbaba, the guardian appointed by the gods. This episode demonstrates their complementary natures. Gilgamesh is brave to the point of recklessness, while Enkidu is more cautious but ultimately loyal. After killing Humbaba, they cut down sacred cedars and return to Uruk in triumph. Their triumph is short-lived. The goddess Ishtar, impressed by Gilgamesh's glory, proposes marriage to him, but Gilgamesh rudely rejects her, cataloging all the lovers she has destroyed in the past. Enraged, Ishtar persuades her father Anu to send the bull of heaven against Uruk. Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill the bull, but this act of divine violence proves too much for the gods to tolerate. They decree that one of the two heroes must die, and Enkidu is chosen. Enkidu's death transforms Gilgamesh completely. The invincible warrior who feared nothing suddenly confronts the reality of mortality. He mourns Enkidu extravagantly, refusing to bury him for 7 days until maggots fall from his friend's corpse. Then, driven by terror of his own death, Gilgamesh abandons his kingdom and wanders into the wilderness, searching for Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who was granted eternal life. The Sumerian king list and the flood. To understand the relationship between Nimrod and Gilgamesh, we must place them in the context of ancient chronologies, both biblical and Mesopotamian. The Bible provides a genealogical framework from Adam to Abraham, with specific numbers of years given for each generation. The Sumerian king list provides a similar framework for the rulers of Sumer, from the beginning of kingship to the dynasty of Isin. Both texts place a great flood at a crucial juncture in their chronologies, and both describe the period after the flood as a time of renewed kingship and city building. Understanding how these chronologies relate to each other is essential for evaluating whether Nimrod and Gilgamesh could be the same figure. The Sumerian king list is a remarkable document, surviving in multiple copies from different periods, that purports to list all the kings who ruled in Sumer from the beginning of history. It begins with the enigmatic statement, "When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu." It then lists kings with impossibly long reigns, measured in thousands of years, before the flood. After the flood, the reigns become shorter, but are still measured in hundreds of years, gradually decreasing over time until they approach historically plausible lengths. The king list is not history in the modern sense. It is a theological and political document designed to legitimate the rulers of the present by connecting them to the glorious past. But it does preserve genuine historical memory, and it provides a framework for understanding how the Mesopotamians conceived of their own history. According to the king list, after the flood, kingship was first established at Kish, then at Uruk, then at Ur, and so on, as different cities rose to dominance. Gilgamesh appears as the 5th king of the first dynasty of Uruk, following his father Lugalbanda and preceding his son Ur-Nungal. His reign is given as 126 years, which, while impossibly long by modern standards, is plausible within the framework of the king list, where reigns of hundreds of years are common for early rulers. The king list also notes that his father was a priest, suggesting a connection between kingship and religious office that is typical of ancient Mesopotamia. The biblical chronology is different in structure but similar in function. Genesis provides a genealogical list from Adam to Noah, with specific ages given for each patriarch. The flood occurs in the time of Noah, and after the flood, the genealogies continue through Shem to Abraham. Nimrod appears in the Table of Nations, which is a different kind of text from the genealogies, listing the descendants of Noah's sons and the nations that descended from them. He is placed in the generation after the flood, as the son of Cush and grandson of Ham. If we calculate the approximate date of the flood based on biblical chronology, using the Masoretic text, we arrive at a date around 2300 to 2400 BCE for the flood, and around 2200-2300 BCE for Nimrod's Florowheat. These dates are roughly contemporary with the Akkadian period in Mesopotamia, the time of Sargon and his successors, rather than the earlier Sumerian period when Gilgamesh is placed. However, biblical chronology is notoriously difficult to reconcile with archaeological and historical dating. The genealogies in Genesis are likely selective, omitting generations to create a schematic framework. The flood itself may not be a single historical event, but a memory of multiple floods that affected Mesopotamia in ancient times. And the dates derived from the biblical text depend on which version of the text one uses, as the Septuagint and Samaritan Pentateuch give different numbers. The chronological question, therefore, is not decisive. It is possible that Nimrod and Gilgamesh lived at roughly the same time, if we allow for the schematic nature of both chronologies. More significant is the role of the flood in both traditions. In the Bible, the flood is a divine judgment on human wickedness, after which humanity is given a fresh start. Nimrod appears as the first great king in this new world, the founder of cities and empires. In Mesopotamian tradition, the flood is also a dividing line, separating the mythical age of long-lived kings from the more historical age that followed. Gilgamesh is placed after the flood, and his story includes the figure of Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian Noah, who survived the flood and was granted immortality. The Gilgamesh epic itself is deeply concerned with the flood, as Utnapishtim's story is the climax of Gilgamesh's quest for eternal life. This connection between Gilgamesh and the flood is significant, as Nimrod is also associated with the post-flood world. But there is a crucial difference. In the biblical tradition, Nimrod is not directly connected to the flood survivor. Noah appears in the genealogies, but Nimrod is several generations removed. In the Gilgamesh epic, the hero actually meets the flood survivor and hears his story firsthand. This suggests that Gilgamesh is conceived of as living much closer to the flood than Nimrod is in the biblical chronology. If the flood is to be dated to around 3000-2800 BCE, as some scholars suggest based on archaeological evidence of flooding in Mesopotamia, then Gilgamesh, dated to around 2700-2600 BCE, would be within a few centuries of the event. Nimrod, depending on how we calculate the biblical chronology, might be several centuries later. Another important source for understanding the relationship between these figures is the Sumerian flood story, which survives in a text known as the Eridu Genesis. This text, like the Gilgamesh epic, tells of a flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity, and of a righteous man who builds a boat and saves himself and the animals. The hero of this story is not Utnapishtim, but Ziusudra, a king of Shuruppak. The text is fragmentary, but it provides evidence that the flood story was deeply embedded in Sumerian tradition long before it was incorporated into the Gilgamesh epic. The fact that both the Bible and Mesopotamian literature place a great flood at a pivotal point in their histories suggests a shared memory of some catastrophic event, though the details differ. What does this mean for the Nimrod-Gilgamesh question? The chronological evidence is ambiguous. If we take the biblical and Sumerian chronologies at face value, they place Nimrod and Gilgamesh in different periods. But if we allow for the schematic and selective nature of these texts, it is possible that they refer to the same historical era. The association of both figures with the post-flood world is significant, as is their connection to the founding of cities. But these similarities may simply reflect the fact that both traditions are describing the same historical process: the emergence of urban civilization in Mesopotamia after a period of disruption. Nimrod and Gilgamesh may both be archetypal figures representing this process rather than specific historical individuals. The Sumerian king list also provides evidence of a figure who may be a closer parallel to Nimrod than Gilgamesh himself. This is Enmerkar, a king of Uruk, who appears in the list as the second king of the first dynasty, preceding Lugalbanda and Gilgamesh. Enmerkar is the hero of a cycle of Sumerian epics that deal with his rivalry with the Lord of Aratta, a city somewhere in Iran. One of these epics, Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, contains a story about the confusion of languages that is strikingly similar to the biblical Tower of Babel account. In this epic, Enmerkar prays to the god Enki to restore linguistic unity to the region, and Enki responds by causing the people to speak a single language. Some scholars have seen in this story a parallel to the Babel narrative, where the confusion of languages is a punishment for human pride. Enmerkar, like Nimrod, is associated with language and with the founding of cities, and some have proposed that he, rather than Gilgamesh, is the historical kernel behind the Nimrod tradition. This raises an important point. The Nimrod of the Bible may not be a single historical figure, but a composite, drawing on memories of several Mesopotamian kings. Gilgamesh, Enmerkar, Sargon of Akkad, and various Assyrian rulers may all have contributed to the portrait of the mighty hunter, the city builder, the founder of empires. The biblical authors were not writing history in the modern sense, but were constructing a theological narrative that used traditional material to make a point about human pride and divine sovereignty. Nimrod serves as a warning, an example of what happens when human power is exercised without reference to God. Whether he corresponds to a specific historical king is almost beside the point. His function in the narrative is what matters. And yet, the question persists. The parallels between Nimrod and Gilgamesh are too numerous and too specific to be dismissed entirely. Both are associated with Uruk, with Babylon, with the land of Shinar. Both are described in terms of hunting and kingship. Both are surrounded by legends that grew over time. Both are figures of immense ambition whose stories explore the limits of human power. The possibility that they are the same figure, remembered differently in different traditions, remains tantalizing. To explore it further, we must turn to the most direct evidence available, the names themselves. The names and their meanings. The most direct way to connect Nimrod and Gilgamesh would be through their names. If the name Nimrod could be shown to be a Hebrew form of the name Gilgamesh, or if Gilgamesh could be identified with some figure known in other traditions as Nimrod, the case would be strong. Unfortunately, the linguistic evidence is far from straightforward, and scholars have proposed multiple etymologies for both names, none of which provides a clear connection. Let us begin with the name Gilgamesh. This is the standard Akkadian form of the name, but in Sumerian, the name is usually rendered as Bilgamesh. The change from B to G is a common phonological shift between Sumerian and Akkadian. The meaning of the name is uncertain. Some scholars have proposed that it means the ancestor is a hero, or the hero is a young man, but these are guesses based on possible Sumerian roots. The name does not have an obvious etymology in either Sumerian or Akkadian, suggesting that it may be very ancient, perhaps pre-Sumerian in origin. The Sumerian king list gives the names of Gilgamesh's father and son, but these do not shed light on his own name. In the Gilgamesh epic, the hero is also given the title or epithet, "He who saw the deep," a reference to his journey to the edge of the world and his encounter with Utnapishtim. This title connects him to the god Ea, who was associated with the underground waters, the deep or abyss. It also connects him to the wisdom tradition, as seeing the deep implies access to hidden knowledge. But this is an epithet, not a name. and it does not help with the Nimrod connection. Now let us consider the name Nimrod. As noted earlier, the Hebrew name Nimrod has no clear etymology in Hebrew. It does not resemble any known Hebrew name, and it does not appear to be derived from a Hebrew root. This has led scholars to look for foreign origins. The most common proposal is that Nimrod is a Hebrew rendering of the name of the Mesopotamian god Ninurta. Ninurta was a major deity in the Sumerian and Akkadian pantheons, a god of war and hunting, the son of Enlil, the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon. He was associated with kingship and with the legitimization of royal power. Many Mesopotamian kings took names that incorporated the element Ninurta, such as Tukulti Ninurta and Ninurta Apal Ekur. The similarity between Nimrod and Ninurta is striking. Both have the element Nim or Nin, followed by a second element that could be related. The Hebrew Nimrod could be a rendering of Ninurta with the final ta dropped or transformed. If Nimrod is Ninurta, then the figure in Genesis is not a human king, but a deity, or perhaps a human king who was deified or associated with the god. This would make sense of some elements of the Nimrod tradition. Ninurta was a hunter god, depicted in art with bow and arrow, pursuing monsters and enemies. He was also a city builder, associated with the construction of temples and walls. His mythology includes the slaying of demons and the organization of the cosmos. If the biblical authors used his name to refer to a human king, they would be making a powerful statement about that king's pretensions. He claimed the attributes of a god. He took to himself the powers that belong only to the divine. This fits perfectly with the later tradition of Nimrod as a rebel against God, a tyrant who claimed divine status. But if Nimrod is Ninurta, then he is not Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was a human king, though of partly divine descent, while Ninurta was a god. The two figures are distinct in Mesopotamian tradition. Gilgamesh prays to Ninurta in the epic, and Ninurta is one of the gods who judges Enkidu after his death. They are separate beings, one mortal, though long-lived, and one immortal, one a king and one a god. The identification of Nimrod with Ninurta would thus argue against his identification with Gilgamesh. However, there is another possibility. Some scholars have proposed that Nimrod is a Hebrew rendering of the name of the Assyrian king Tukulti Ninurta Huarn, who ruled in the 13th century BCE and was a famous conqueror and builder. Tukulti Ninurta means, "My trust is in Ninurta," and the name could be shortened to Ninurta in popular usage. This king defeated the Kassite rulers of Babylon and brought the city under Assyrian control, and he built a new capital city named Tukulti Ninurta. He was a figure of immense power and ambition, and his deeds could have been remembered in the region for centuries. If Nimrod is Tukulti Ninurta, then he is a much later figure than Gilgamesh, separated by more than 1,000 years. This identification is plausible chronologically, as Tukulti Ninurta lived around the time when the biblical traditions were being formed, but it would again separate Nimrod from Gilgamesh. A third possibility is that Nimrod is derived from the name of the Sumerian king Enmerkar, mentioned earlier. Enmerkar was the second king of Uruk, preceding Gilgamesh, and his name contains the element En, meaning Lord, and Merkar, which is of uncertain meaning. The similarity to Nimrod is not obvious, but some scholars have proposed that Nimrod could be a corruption of Enmerkar through intermediate forms. The association of Enmerkar with the confusion of languages, as in the epic Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, makes him a strong candidate for the original of the Nimrod tradition, as we shall explore later. If Nimrod is Enmerkar, then he is a king of Uruk from the same dynasty as Gilgamesh, but a different figure. They would be related perhaps as ancestor and descendant, but not identical. A fourth possibility is that Nimrod is a Hebrew rendering of the name of the god Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon. Marduk was the chief god of the Babylonian pantheon, and his name could be rendered in Hebrew with some similarity to Nimrod if the initial M were changed to N and other modifications made. Marduk was associated with the creation of the world, with the defeat of the chaos monster Tiamat, and with the establishment of cosmic order. He was also the god of Babylon, the city that Nimrod founded. If Nimrod is Marduk, then again we have a deity rather than a human king, and the biblical figure would be a personification of Babylonian religion and culture, a symbol of the pride and idolatry that the Bible condemns. None of these proposed etymologies is universally accepted. The name Nimrod remains mysterious, and its origins may never be known with certainty. What is clear is that the name does not obviously correspond to Gilgamesh. The two names are not similar in sound or structure, and no plausible linguistic pathway connects them. This is a significant obstacle to the identification. If Nimrod and Gilgamesh were the same figure, we would expect the names to be related in some way, as with other figures who appear in both biblical and extra-biblical sources. For example, the name Sargon appears in the Bible as Sargon in Isaiah, clearly referring to the Assyrian king. The name Hammurabi does not appear in the Bible, but if it did, it would be recognizable. The fact that Nimrod does not resemble Gilgamesh suggests that they are different figures. However, names can change dramatically when they pass from one language to another, especially over long periods of time. The Greeks called the Egyptian god Thoth Hermes, which bears no resemblance to the original. The Romans called the Greek god Zeus Jupiter, which is completely different. If the name Gilgamesh passed from Sumerian to Akkadian to Aramaic to Hebrew, it could have been transformed beyond recognition. The fact that we cannot trace a clear linguistic path from Gilgamesh to Nimrod does not prove that such a path never existed, but it does mean that the burden of proof rests on those who would make the identification, and that burden is heavy. The names, then, provide no clear answer. They are consistent with the possibility that Nimrod and Gilgamesh are the same figure, but they do not require it, and they offer no positive evidence in favor of it. To move forward, we must look beyond the names to the deeds attributed to each figure, the cities they founded, the legends that grew up around them, and the cultural contexts in which they were remembered. It is to these that we now turn. The cities they built. The cities that Nimrod and Gilgamesh are associated with provide some of the strongest evidence for a connection between them. The Bible explicitly states that Nimrod's kingdom began with Babel, Uruk, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. These are all major Mesopotamian cities, and their identification with known archaeological sites is reasonably secure. Babel is Babylon, the great city on the Euphrates that would become the capital of Hammurabi's empire, and later the center of Nebuchadnezzar's Neo-Babylonian empire. Uruk is Uruk, the city of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest and most important cities in Sumerian history. Akkad is Agade, the capital of the Akkadian Empire, founded by Sargon the Great, though its exact location has never been definitively identified. Calneh is more uncertain, but many scholars identify it with Nippur, the religious center of Sumer, or with the city of Kulab, a district of Uruk. The inclusion of Uruk in this list is particularly significant. Uruk was not just any city, it was the city of Gilgamesh, the place where he ruled and where his story was set. If Nimrod is credited with founding Uruk and Gilgamesh is the most famous king of Uruk, the natural conclusion is that Nimrod and Gilgamesh are connected. Either Nimrod founded the city that Gilgamesh later ruled, or Nimrod is Gilgamesh himself, remembered as the founder because he was the first great king. The Bible does not say that Nimrod ruled these cities, only that they were the beginning of his kingdom. He could have founded them and then passed them on to successors, of whom Gilgamesh might be one. But the wording suggests that his kingdom was constituted by these cities, that they were the centers of his power. This would make him the first king to unite them under a single rule, a plausible description of an early Mesopotamian empire builder. The inclusion of Babel is also significant. Babylon became the dominant city of Mesopotamia only later, under Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE. In the time of Gilgamesh, around 2700 BCE, Babylon was a minor town, if it existed at all. The rise of Babylon to prominence came much later, and the association of Babylon with Nimrod in Genesis reflects a time when Babylon was already the great city it became. This has led some scholars to argue that Nimrod cannot be Gilgamesh, because Gilgamesh lived before Babylon was important. But the biblical text does not necessarily claim that Babylon was already great in Nimrod's time. It simply lists it as one of the cities of his kingdom. The list could be retrospective, using the later names of cities that existed in earlier times under different names. Uruk, for example, was called Uruk in Sumerian and Erech in Hebrew. Babylon was called Babel in Hebrew, but its earlier name was probably something else. The use of the later name does not prove that the city was already important. The inclusion of Akkad, a god, is also chronologically problematic. The Akkadian Empire, with its capital at Agad, was founded by Sargon around 2300 BCE, centuries after Gilgamesh. If Nimrod founded Agad, he would have to be dated to the Akkadian period, not the earlier Sumerian period. But again, the biblical list may be using later names for earlier cities. There may have been a city on the site of Agade before Sargon made it his capital, and that city could have been part of Nimrod's kingdom. Alternatively, the name Akkad in Genesis may not refer to the city of Agade at all, but to the region of Akkad, the northern part of Babylonia. The phrase Babel, Erech, and Akkad could be read as Babylon, Uruk, and the land of Akkad, indicating the major components of Nimrod's realm. The inclusion of Calneh is even more uncertain. If Calneh is Nippur, then Nimrod's kingdom included the religious center of Sumer, the city of the god Enlil. Nippur was a holy city, not a political capital, but it was central to Sumerian identity. If Nimrod controlled Nippur, he would have had religious as well as political authority. If Calneh is Kulab, a district of Uruk, then it is redundant with Erech, and the list would be emphasizing different parts of the same city. This is possible, as ancient cities often had multiple names for different districts. The second part of the biblical account has Nimrod going to Assyria and building Nineveh, Calah, and other cities. These are major Assyrian cities that flourished in the first millennium BCE. Nineveh became the capital of the Assyrian Empire under Sennacherib, and Calah, Nimrud, was an earlier capital. The association of Nimrod with these Assyrian cities is striking, as it extends his influence beyond Babylonia into the north. Gilgamesh is not associated with Assyria in the epic. His world is Sumer, not the northern region. But later, Assyrian kings adopted Gilgamesh as a cultural hero, and the most complete version of the epic was found in the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. The Assyrians saw themselves as heirs to Sumerian culture, and they preserved and transmitted the Gilgamesh tradition. It is possible that they also identified Gilgamesh with the founder of their own cities, creating a connection that the Bible preserves. The building of Nineveh is particularly interesting. In the Gilgamesh epic, the hero is associated with the walls of Uruk, which are described in the opening and closing lines as his enduring monument, but he is not credited with building Nineveh. However, there is a tradition, preserved in some sources, that Gilgamesh built the walls of Nineveh as well. This tradition may have been known to the biblical authors or to the sources they used. If so, then Nimrod's building of Nineveh could be a reference to Gilgamesh's activity there. The cities, then, provide a mixed picture. Nimrod is associated with Uruk, the city of Gilgamesh, which is a strong point of connection, but he is also associated with Babylon and Nineveh, cities that rose to prominence long after Gilgamesh's time. This could be explained by the retrospective nature of the biblical account, which uses later names for earlier places and attributes to a single founding figure the creation of cities that were actually built over many centuries. Nimrod, in this view, is not a historical individual, but a symbol of Mesopotamian civilization, the archetypal city builder to whom all the great cities were attributed. The archaeological evidence from these cities is also relevant. Uruk, in the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE, was the largest city in the world, with monumental architecture, a complex society, and the invention of writing. This was the Uruk period, named after the city, and it represents the emergence of urban civilization in Mesopotamia. If Gilgamesh was a historical king, he would have ruled during this period or shortly after. The Uruk period ended around 3000 BCE, and the early dynastic period, when Gilgamesh is placed by the king list, began around 2900 BCE. This is roughly consistent with a date of 2700–2600 BCE for Gilgamesh. Nimrod, if he is the founder of these cities, would belong to the same era. The founding of Uruk, Babylon, and the other cities would have to be placed in the early 3rd millennium, which is historically plausible. Babylon, as noted, was not important at that time, but it did exist as a small settlement. The attribution of its founding to Nimrod could be a later tradition, reading back the city's later importance into its origins. The archaeological evidence, then, does not rule out the identification of Nimrod with Gilgamesh. It is consistent with the possibility that a powerful king of Uruk in the early 3rd millennium BCE established a kingdom that included other Mesopotamian cities, and that this king was remembered in later tradition as Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia and as Nimrod in the Bible, but the evidence is not conclusive and other interpretations are possible. To strengthen the case, we must look beyond the cities to the deeds attributed to each figure, the legends that grew up around them, and the ways in which they were remembered in later tradition. The hunter and the hero. The description of Nimrod as a mighty hunter before the Lord is one of the most distinctive elements of his biblical portrait. Hunting was an important activity in the ancient world, associated with kingship, with the exercise of power over the natural world, and with the protection of the community from wild beasts. But the phrase mighty hunter carries additional connotations. It suggests not just skill in hunting, but a kind of heroic status, a figure who dominates his environment and imposes his will on the world around him. The same phrase, mighty hunter, could be applied to Gilgamesh, whose exploits in the epic include the slaying of the monster Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven, acts that can be understood as hunting on a cosmic scale. The hunting motif in the Gilgamesh epic is complex and multifaceted. The epic begins with Gilgamesh as a hunter of men, or at least as an oppressor of his people, and the gods create Enkidu as a counterpart, a wild man who lives among the animals. Enkidu is a hunter in the original sense, living off the land and protecting the animals from human hunters. When the trapper complains that Enkidu is freeing the animals from his traps, the gods send Shamhat to civilize him. After his encounter with Shamhat, Enkidu becomes a hunter of a different kind, accompanying Gilgamesh on his heroic quests. The first great adventure is the hunt for Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest. Humbaba is not an animal, but a monstrous being appointed by the god Enlil to protect the forest. Slaying him is an act of heroism that requires courage, strength, and divine assistance. Gilgamesh undertakes the quest for fame to leave a name that will last forever. The hunt is a test of his heroic status, a way of proving that he deserves the fame he seeks. When he succeeds, he returns in triumph, but the deed has consequences that lead ultimately to Enkidu's death. The second hunt is for the Bull of Heaven, sent by the goddess Ishtar to destroy Uruk after Gilgamesh rejects her advances. The bull is a divine creature, an embodiment of destructive power. Slaying it is an even greater act of defiance against the gods, and it seals Enkidu's fate. The hunt is not for food or for protection, but for honor, for the defense of the city against divine wrath. Gilgamesh and Enkidu together accomplish what no one else could, and their fame grows, but so does the anger of the gods. These hunts are not the only hunting imagery in the epic. After Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh roams the wilderness like a hunter, wearing animal skins and seeking the secret of immortality. He hunts for the plant that will restore youth, and when he finds it, he loses it to a snake, which becomes the ultimate hunter, stealing his prize. The hunting motif runs throughout the epic, connecting Gilgamesh to the natural world, to the heroic tradition, and to the quest for meaning in the face of death. Nimrod's hunting is not described in detail in the Bible. We are not told what he hunted or how he hunted. The phrase, mighty hunter before the Lord, is all we have. But in later tradition, Nimrod's hunting became elaborated. He was said to have hunted wild beasts and to have worn their skins, like Gilgamesh after Enkidu's death. He was said to have been a hunter of men as well as animals, a conqueror who subdued the peoples of the earth. The hunting motif connects him to the heroic tradition of the ancient Near East, a tradition in which Gilgamesh was the preeminent figure. The phrase, before the Lord, in connection with Nimrod's hunting is particularly interesting. It could mean that his hunting was done in the sight of God, that God was aware of his deeds. It could mean that he hunted in opposition to God, that his hunting was a form of rebellion. Or it could be an idiom meaning, in the estimation of the Lord, indicating that he was the greatest hunter in the world. The ambiguity allows for multiple interpretations, and later tradition exploited this ambiguity to portray Nimrod as a rebel against God. If Nimrod is Gilgamesh, then his hunting before the Lord takes on additional meaning. Gilgamesh's hunts were done in defiance of the gods, at least in part. He slew Humbaba despite Enlil's protection, and he slew the bull of heaven despite Ishtar's anger. He acted as if he were equal to the gods, and the gods punished him for it. This fits perfectly with the later tradition of Nimrod as a rebel, a tyrant who challenged divine authority. The biblical phrase, mighty hunter before the Lord, could be a subtle allusion to this theme, a hint that Nimrod's hunting was not innocent sport, but an assertion of power that put him in opposition to God. The hunting motif also connects to the broader theme of civilization versus wilderness. In the Gilgamesh epic, Enkidu represents the wilderness, the natural world before civilization. His encounter with Shamhat brings him into the civilized world, and his friendship with Gilgamesh represents the integration of wildness into culture. The hunts for Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven are acts of civilization, imposing order on the chaotic forces of nature and the divine. Nimrod, as the founder of cities, is similarly a civilizing figure, bringing order to the world after the flood. The hunter and the city builder are two aspects of the same heroic figure, the one who tames the wilderness and builds the city, who imposes human order on the natural and supernatural worlds. There is another figure in Mesopotamian tradition who might be relevant here, the god Ninurta, who was both a hunter and a city builder. Ninurta's mythology includes the slaying of various monsters, including the Asag, a demon of disease and chaos. After his victories, Ninurta organizes the world, building dams and canals, establishing agriculture, and creating civilization. He is the archetypal civilizing hero, the one who defeats chaos and establishes order. If Nimrod is Ninurta, as the name similarity suggests, then the hunting motif is explained. He is the divine hunter who clears the world of monsters and makes it safe for human habitation. But if Nimrod is Ninurta, he is not Gilgamesh, as Gilgamesh is a human hero who prays to Ninurta, not the god himself. The hunting motif, then, provides suggestive parallels but not conclusive evidence. Both Nimrod and Gilgamesh are hunters, but hunting was a common attribute of kings and heroes in the ancient world. Many Mesopotamian rulers describe themselves as hunters, and hunting scenes appear frequently in royal art. The motif is too widespread to be a reliable indicator of identity. What matters is the specific kind of hunting each does and the meaning attached to it. For Gilgamesh, hunting is a heroic quest, a defiance of the gods, a search for fame. For Nimrod, hunting is a mark of his power, his status as a mighty one on the earth. The two conceptions are compatible, even complementary, but they are not unique to these figures. The later tradition that Nimrod hunted men as well as animals, that he was a tyrant who enslaved the peoples he conquered, adds another dimension. This tradition portrays Nimrod as a hunter of humans, a figure who treats people as prey. Gilgamesh, at the beginning of the epic, is also a hunter of humans in a sense, oppressing his people and taking whatever he wants. His transformation through his friendship with Enkidu tempers this aspect of his character, but the parallel is there. The arrogant, oppressive king is a type that both Nimrod and Gilgamesh exemplify. Ultimately, the hunting motif supports the identification of Nimrod and Gilgamesh as similar types of heroic figures, but it does not prove they are the same person. The evidence from the cities is stronger, the evidence from the names weaker. We must weigh all the evidence together and consider the possibility that the biblical Nimrod is a composite figure, drawing on memories of Gilgamesh, Enmerkar, Ninurta, and other Mesopotamian heroes and gods, shaped by the theological concerns of the biblical authors into a symbol of human pride and divine judgment. The Tower of Babel and the Confusion of Tongues. No discussion of Nimrod would be complete without considering the Tower of Babel, though the Bible does not explicitly connect Nimrod to the tower. The tower story appears in Genesis 11, immediately after the Table of Nations in which Nimrod is introduced. The proximity of the accounts has led most readers, ancient and modern, to assume that Nimrod was the leader of the tower-building project, the king who led humanity in its rebellion against God. Later tradition made this connection explicit, portraying Nimrod as the architect of the tower and the instigator of the confusion of languages. The Tower of Babel story is one of the most famous in the Bible, Humanity, speaking a single language, gathers in the land of Shinar and decides to build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens to make a name for themselves and to avoid being scattered over the earth. God sees their project and says, "Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them." God then confuses their language so that they cannot understand one another and scatters them over the earth. The city is called Babel because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. The story is a profound meditation on human pride and divine sovereignty. The tower builders seek to make a name for themselves, to achieve fame and unity through their own efforts. But God shows that human ambition is limited by divine power. The confusion of languages is both a punishment and a limitation, ensuring that humanity will not be able to unite in rebellion against God. The story also explains the diversity of languages and the scattering of peoples across the earth. The connection between this story and Nimrod is natural. Nimrod is presented as the first great king, the founder of cities, the mighty hunter. The tower is built in the land of Shinar, where Nimrod's kingdom began. The city of Babel is listed as the first city of Nimrod's kingdom. The tower builders seek to make a name for themselves, and Nimrod is the one who has a name, whose fame spreads through his deeds. Later traditions simply made explicit what the text implies. Nimrod was the leader of the tower project. In Jewish and Islamic tradition, Nimrod's role in building the tower is elaborated in detail. He is portrayed as a tyrant who commands the people to build the tower as a way of reaching heaven and challenging God's authority. He ascends to the top and shoots arrows into the sky, which return stained with blood, convincing him that he has wounded the angels. He claims divine status for himself and demands that the people worship him. God confuses their languages and scatters them. And Nimrod's power is broken. In some versions, he is eventually killed by a mosquito that enters his brain and drives him mad, a fitting end for the tyrant who challenged heaven. This tradition connects Nimrod directly to the theme of language and its confusion. The tower builders sought unity through a single language, but their pride led to diversity. Nimrod, as their leader, is responsible for this division. In the Gilgamesh epic, language also plays a role. The epic exists in multiple languages and versions, reflecting the linguistic diversity of Mesopotamia. The story of Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, mentioned earlier, includes an episode about the confusion of languages. In that story, Enmerkar prays to the god Enki to restore linguistic unity to the region, and Enki responds by causing the people to speak a single language. This is the opposite of the biblical story. Instead of confusion, there is unification. But the theme of language as a divine concern is common to both. The Enmerkar story is particularly interesting because it provides a Mesopotamian parallel to the Babel narrative. In Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, the hero wishes to have the people of Aratta submit to him, but they speak a different language. He prays to Enki, and Enki changes the language of the region so that all speak the same tongue. This is a story of linguistic unification, not confusion, but it shows that the ancient Mesopotamians were interested in the origin of languages and the relationship between language and power. If Enmerkar is the original of Nimrod, then the connection to the Babel story is even stronger, as Enmerkar is explicitly associated with linguistic manipulation. But what of Gilgamesh? The Gilgamesh epic does not contain a story about the confusion of languages. Gilgamesh is not associated with language in the way that Enmerkar is. This is a point against identifying him with Nimrod. If Nimrod is primarily the figure associated with the Tower of Babel, then Enmerkar, with his story of linguistic unification, is a better candidate. However, the association of Nimrod with the tower is a later development, not explicit in the biblical text. The original Nimrod of Genesis may not have been connected to the tower at all. The connection came later through interpretation. If Nimrod is Gilgamesh, then his association with the tower would be a secondary development, reading back into his story a theme that was originally associated with someone else. The location of the tower is also significant. The tower was built in the land of Shinar, which is Sumer and Akkad. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the great temple towers that rose in stages toward the sky, are the most likely inspiration for the biblical tower. Every major Mesopotamian city had a ziggurat dedicated to its patron deity. The ziggurat of Babylon, called Edamananki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, was particularly famous and may have been the direct inspiration for the biblical story. If Nimrod is associated with Babylon and its ziggurat, then he is connected to the tower. Gilgamesh, as king of Uruk, would have had his own ziggurat, but the most famous ziggurat was at Babylon. The theme of making a name is also significant. The tower builders want to make a name for themselves, to achieve fame that will last. This is exactly what Gilgamesh seeks in the epic. He undertakes his quest for Humbaba specifically to make a name that will endure. He says to Enkidu, "I will establish my name in the place where the names of famous men are written." His entire quest is driven by the desire for fame, for a legacy that will outlast his death. This is precisely the motivation of the tower builders. The parallel is striking and suggests a common theme: human ambition seeking to transcend mortality through enduring works. The scattering of the peoples after the tower is also paralleled in the Gilgamesh epic, though in a different way. After Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh is scattered in a different sense. He wanders the wilderness, alone and grieving, separated from human society. He becomes a figure of isolation, cut off from the community he once ruled. This is not the scattering of peoples, but the scattering of a single individual, a different kind of dispersion. But the theme of separation, of being cut off from others, is present in both stories. Ultimately, the Tower of Babel story provides a rich set of connections to Mesopotamian culture and to the themes of the Gilgamesh epic: the desire for fame, the building of great structures, the relationship between human ambition and divine limitation. All these are central to both traditions. Whether they are sufficient to identify Nimrod with Gilgamesh is another question. The connections are thematic, not specific. They show that the biblical and Mesopotamian traditions were grappling with similar issues, drawing on a common cultural heritage, but they do not prove that the same historical figure lies behind both. The scholars debate. The question of whether Nimrod is Gilgamesh has been debated by scholars for more than a century, since the first decipherment of Cuneiform revealed the riches of Mesopotamian literature. The debate has waxed and waned over the years, with different scholars offering different arguments and reaching different conclusions. Examining the history of this debate helps us understand the complexities of the issue and the reasons why it remains unresolved. The earliest scholars to compare the Bible with Mesopotamian sources were struck by the similarities between the two traditions. George Smith, the 19th century Assyriologist who first translated the Gilgamesh epic, noted the parallels between the biblical flood story and the Mesopotamian flood narrative embedded in the epic. He also noted the similarities between Nimrod and Gilgamesh, suggesting that they might be the same figure. Other early scholars, such as Eberhard Schroeder and Friedrich Delitzsch, developed this idea further, arguing that Nimrod was a Hebrew version of the name of the god Marduk, or of the king Gilgamesh. The most influential proponent of the identification was the German scholar Hermann Gunkel, whose commentary on Genesis, published in 1901, argued that Nimrod was a figure drawn from Mesopotamian tradition and that his portrayal in Genesis reflected knowledge of Mesopotamian myths and legends. Gunkel suggested that Nimrod was based on Gilgamesh, whom he described as the archetypal Mesopotamian hero. His arguments were widely accepted and influenced a generation of biblical scholars. However, other scholars were more skeptical. The British Assyriologist Archibald Sayce argued that Nimrod was not Gilgamesh, but a composite figure drawn from multiple sources. He pointed out that the cities associated with Nimrod spanned different periods of Mesopotamian history, and that no single king could have founded them all. He suggested that Nimrod was a legendary figure, a symbol of Mesopotamian power, rather than a historical individual. The discovery of the Sumerian king list and the epics of Enmerkar added new dimensions to the debate. Scholars began to notice that Enmerkar, not Gilgamesh, was associated with the confusion of languages in Mesopotamian tradition. This led some to propose that Nimrod was based on Enmerkar rather than Gilgamesh. The Dutch scholar Frans de Liagre Boel argued for this identification, noting the parallels between the Enmerkar epic and the Tower of Babel story. Other scholars looked to the god Ninurta as the source of the Nimrod tradition. The American Assyriologist E.A. Spicer argued that Nimrod was a Hebrew rendering of Ninurta, and that the biblical figure was originally a deity rather than a human king. He noted that Ninurta was a hunter god, and that his mythology included the slaying of monsters, which could have been the basis for the mighty hunter description. He also noted that Ninurta was associated with kingship, and that many Mesopotamian kings took names incorporating his. The debate took a new turn with the work of the Israeli scholar Yigael Yadin, who argued that Nimrod was based on historical memories of the Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta-Ur. Yadin pointed out that Tukulti-Ninurta was a mighty conqueror who defeated Babylon and built a new capital, and that his deeds could have been remembered in the region for centuries. He also noted that the name Tukulti-Ninurta could be shortened to Ninurta, which could then be rendered as Nimrod in Hebrew. This identification had the advantage of being chronologically plausible, as Tukulti-Ninurta lived in the 13th century BCE, around the time when the biblical traditions were being formed. More recently, scholars have tended to be more cautious, recognizing that the question may not have a single answer. The current consensus, to the extent that there is one, is that Nimrod is a composite figure, drawing on memories of several Mesopotamian kings and gods, shaped by the theological concerns of the biblical authors into a symbol of human pride and divine judgment. He represents Mesopotamian civilization as a whole, with its great cities, its powerful kings, and its pretensions to divine status. The specific details of his portrayal may come from different sources, but the overall figure is a literary construct, not a historical individual. This consensus does not rule out the possibility that Gilgamesh contributed to the Nimrod tradition. Gilgamesh was the most famous hero of Mesopotamian literature, and his story was known throughout the ancient Near East. It would be surprising if the biblical authors, or the sources they used, were not aware of him. The association of Nimrod with Uruk, Gilgamesh's city, is strong evidence that Gilgamesh was part of the mix, but he was not the only part. Enmerkar, Ninurta, Tukulti-Ninurta, and others also contributed. The debate also touches on broader issues of methodology. How do we compare biblical and extra-biblical sources? What counts as evidence for influence or borrowing? How do we distinguish between parallel development and direct dependence? These are difficult questions, and different scholars answer them differently. Some see parallels everywhere and are quick to posit influence. Others are more cautious, demanding clear evidence before concluding that one tradition has borrowed from another. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and other ancient texts has complicated the picture further. These texts show that the Nimrod tradition continued to develop in the Second Temple period, with new details being added and old ones reinterpreted. The Nimrod of the Book of Jubilees, for example, is a more developed figure than the Nimrod of Genesis, with specific deeds and a clearer role in the narrative. This suggests that the tradition was alive and evolving, not fixed and static. The same was true of the Gilgamesh tradition in Mesopotamia, which continued to be copied and adapted for centuries. Given this complexity, it is unlikely that the question of whether Nimrod is Gilgamesh will ever be definitively answered. The evidence is too fragmentary, too ambiguous, and too open to interpretation. What we can say is that there are significant parallels between the two figures, that they belong to the same cultural and historical context, and that later tradition often conflated them or associated them with each other. The identification is plausible, even suggestive, but it cannot be proven. For the purposes of this documentary, we must hold the question open, acknowledging both the connections and the differences. Nimrod and Gilgamesh are two windows into the same world, the world of ancient Mesopotamia, where kings built cities, hunted monsters, and sought to make names for themselves that would last forever. Whether they are the same king or different kings, they represent the same human ambition, the same drive to transcend mortality through great deeds, and the same confrontation with the divine that lies at the heart of both the biblical and the Mesopotamian traditions. The legacy. We have journeyed through the ancient world, exploring the figures of Nimrod and Gilgamesh, their cities and their deeds, their names and their legends. We have examined the biblical text and the Mesopotamian epics, the archaeological evidence, and the scholarly debates. We have seen the parallels that suggest a connection and the differences that complicate it. And we have come to understand that the question, is Nimrod Gilgamesh, is not a simple one, not a matter of yes or no, but a gateway into the complex world of ancient history and mythology. What emerges from this investigation is not a single answer, but a deeper appreciation for the richness of the traditions we have explored. Nimrod, whether historical or legendary, real or composite, stands at the beginning of the biblical account of human civilization after the flood. He is the first king, the first empire builder, the first to unite cities under a single rule. His portrayal in Genesis, brief though it is, sets the stage for everything that follows: the rise and fall of empires, the tension between human power and divine sovereignty, the pride that goes before a fall. He is a warning and an example, a figure whose ambition leads him to oppose God and whose name becomes a byword for tyranny. Gilgamesh, whether historical or legendary, real or composite, stands at the beginning of Mesopotamian literature. His epic is the first great work of world literature, a story that explores the deepest questions of human existence: friendship and loss, love and death, the search for meaning in a world that offers no guarantees. He is 2/3 God and 1/3 human, a figure who straddles the boundary between mortal and immortal, whose quest for eternal life ends not in triumph but in acceptance, not in possession but in understanding. His story has resonated across the millennia, translated into countless languages, and adapted to countless cultures, because it speaks to something universal in the human condition. The parallels between these two figures are not coincidental. They arise from a shared cultural heritage, a common world of ideas and images that shaped both the biblical and the Mesopotamian traditions. The cities they built, the hunts they undertook, the ambitions they embodied, all reflect the values and concerns of the ancient Near East, a world where kings were expected to be heroes, where cities were the centers of civilization, where the gods were intimately involved in human affairs. Nimrod and Gilgamesh are two expressions of this world, two ways of telling the story of the first great kings. Whether they are the same king is ultimately less important than what they represent. Both are figures of human ambition, reaching for the heavens, seeking to transcend the limits of mortality. Both are builders, creators of the cities that would become the centers of civilization. Both are hunters, exercisers of dominion over the natural world. Both are flawed, complex characters whose stories warn us of the dangers of pride while also celebrating the achievements of human culture. In the later tradition, Nimrod and Gilgamesh continued to evolve, absorbing new elements and acquiring new meanings. Nimrod became the arch-tyrant of Jewish and Islamic legend, the persecutor of Abraham, the builder of the tower, the rebel against God. Gilgamesh became a figure of wisdom and mystery, associated with the underworld and with secret knowledge. In some traditions, they merged, with Gilgamesh taking on the attributes of Nimrod, and Nimrod the attributes of Gilgamesh. The distinction between them blurred, as it had perhaps always been blurred, two faces of the same archetypal king. For the modern reader, the question remains open. We can weigh the evidence and draw our own conclusions, but we must do so with humility, recognizing the limits of our knowledge and the fragmentary nature of our sources. The ancient world is distant from us. Its voices faint, its texts broken, its meanings elusive. We can reconstruct only a small part of what was once a vast and living tradition. The rest is lost, buried in the sands of Uruk, waiting to be discovered, or perhaps lost forever. What we can say with confidence is that Nimrod and Gilgamesh are connected, part of the same cultural conversation, products of the same historical forces. They are brothers under the skin, two versions of the ancient king, the founder of cities, the hunter of monsters, the seeker after fame. Their stories illuminate each other, and together they illuminate the world that produced them. As we conclude this investigation, we are left with more questions than answers. Who was Nimrod? Who was Gilgamesh? Were they real people or legendary constructs? Did they live and rule in the cities whose ruins still stand in the deserts of Iraq? Or are they figures of myth, embodiments of human aspiration and human limitation? The answers, if they exist, lie buried in the past, beyond our reach. But perhaps that is as it should be. The ancient world is a mystery, and its greatest figures are shrouded in legend. Nimrod and Gilgamesh belong to that misty realm where history and myth meet, where fact and fiction blend, where the boundaries between what happened and what was imagined are impossible to draw. They are figures of the imagination as much as of history, and their power over us comes not from their historical reality, but from the stories they inspired. The question, is Nimrod Gilgamesh, may never be answered to everyone's satisfaction, but the journey of asking it has taken us to the dawn of civilization, to the birth of cities and writing and kingship, to the very foundations of our world, and that journey, whatever its destination, is worthwhile in itself. It reminds us of the depth and richness of the human past, of the stories that have shaped us, of the questions that still haunt us. In the end, perhaps the answer is not either or, but both and. Nimrod is Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh is Nimrod, not in the sense of being the same historical individual, but in the sense of being the same archetype, the same embodiment of human ambition and human limitation. They are two names for the same thing: the human desire to build, to conquer, to make a name that will last forever, and that desire, for good and for ill, is as old as civilization itself. The walls of Uruk still stand, or traces of them do, in the desert of southern Iraq. The ziggurat of Babylon is gone, its bricks scattered, its location marked only by a depression in the earth. But the stories remain, passed down through generations, written on clay and parchment and paper, told and retold in countless languages. Nimrod and Gilgamesh live on in these stories, as alive today as they were 4,000 years ago. They walk among us still, in the pages of books, in the words of scholars, in the imagination of all who wonder about the beginning of things, about the first kings, about the mighty hunters who built the world. Conclusion. The question with which we began has led us on a long journey through the ancient world. We have explored the biblical portrait of Nimrod, the mighty hunter, the founder of cities, the first king after the flood. We have explored the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, the two-thirds divine hero, the seeker after immortality, the builder of the walls of Uruk. We have examined the cities they built, the names they bore, the deeds they performed, the legends that grew up around them. We have listened to the scholars' debate, weighing evidence and argument, reaching different conclusions. And we have come to understand that the question, is Nimrod Gilgamesh, is not a simple one, not a matter of yes or no, but a gateway into the complex world of ancient history and mythology. The evidence we have examined points in multiple directions. The association of both figures with Uruk, with Babylon, with the land of Shinar is striking. The description of both as hunters, as mighty ones, as founders of cities is suggestive. The thematic parallels between the Gilgamesh epic and the Nimrod traditions, particularly the concern with fame, with building, with the limits of human ambition, are compelling. But the names do not match, the chronologies are difficult to reconcile, and the specific details of each tradition diverge in significant ways. Perhaps the most reasonable conclusion is that Nimrod is a composite figure, drawing on memories of several Mesopotamian kings and gods. Gilgamesh was certainly one of these, the most famous hero of Mesopotamian literature, the king of Uruk, whose story was known throughout the ancient Near East. And Merkar, with his association with the confusion of languages, may also have contributed. Ninurta, the hunter god, may have provided the name and some of the attributes. Tukulti Ninurta, the Assyrian conqueror, may have contributed elements from a later period. The biblical authors, or the sources they used, wove these various strands together into a single figure who embodied Mesopotamian civilization and its pretensions. In this composite figure, Gilgamesh plays a central role. He is the archetypal Mesopotamian king, the hero whose quest for fame and immortality encapsulates the human ambition that the Bible critiques. His story, with its themes of pride and loss, of friendship and grief, of the search for meaning in the face of death, resonates with the biblical concern for the limits of human power. The Nimrod of Genesis, brief though his portrait is, carries echoes of this greater story. He is Gilgamesh, not in the sense of being the same historical individual, but in the sense of being the same kind of figure, the same embodiment of human aspiration. And so we return to where we began, with the question that has haunted scholars and readers for centuries. Is Nimrod Gilgamesh? The answer, we have learned, is not a simple yes or no. It is yes, in the sense that Gilgamesh contributed to the portrait of Nimrod, that the two figures share a common cultural heritage, that their stories illuminate each other, and it is no, in the sense that Nimrod is more than Gilgamesh, that other figures contributed to his portrayal, that the biblical Nimrod serves a specific theological purpose that goes beyond the historical or legendary Gilgamesh. Perhaps the best answer is this: Nimrod is the Bible's version of the Mesopotamian hero king, the figure who embodies everything that the biblical authors found problematic about human civilization. He is Gilgamesh seen through Hebrew eyes, interpreted through Hebrew theology, transformed into a warning about the dangers of pride and the limits of human power. He is Gilgamesh, but he is also more than Gilgamesh, a figure who transcends his origins to become something new. In the end, the question matters less than the journey of asking it. That journey has taken us to the dawn of civilization, to the birth of cities and writing and kingship, to the very foundations of our world. It has introduced us to two of the most fascinating figures of the ancient world, whose stories have resonated across the millennia and continue to speak to us today. It has reminded us of the depth and richness of the human past, of the power of stories to shape our understanding of ourselves and our world. Nimrod and Gilgamesh walk among us still, in the pages of the Bible and the epic, in the ruins of Uruk and Babylon, in the imagination of all who wonder about the beginning of things. They are our ancestors, our teachers, our warnings, and our inspirations. And their stories, whether history or legend, whether separate or merged, will continue to be told as long as humans seek to understand who they are and where they came from. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.